Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to your CPT Live course. I appreciate you joining me this morning. We're running through Module 7 today, already on 7 of 10 of your CPT Live modules that we have. So good to see some folks back with us today. As with yesterday, there's going to be a lot of slides here to go through. We're going through chapters 12, which is the concepts of resistance training today, and we can go ahead and click on over to the next slide. And then we're also going to chapter 13, exercise selection and technique. Some of chapter 12, fortunately, is a review of what we talked about yesterday morning, specifically regarding the acute variables of resistance training. So we'll be able to go back over some of that information, as I know that we went through that information relatively quickly during the introductory period yesterday. As always, we have some learning objectives for you. We'll just bring these up so that you can see what the learning objectives are. There's learning objectives for every chapter in your course. As always, read through the learning objectives as you're going in and reading the chapters of your textbook. And if you feel confident that you're able to explain these objectives in your own words, you're good to go for your final exam there at that time. So these are just great learning tools for you to have to make sure that you're picking up the key bits of information here as we go through. So let's go ahead here. We are going to dive into chapter 12, concepts of resistance training. And when we start talking about the concepts of resistance training, we always want to make sure that we're outlining the benefits of resistance training. And really, regardless of a client's goal that they have, resistance training really should be a part of their program. There's just so many benefits to resistance training, and it really applies to a variety of goals, whether someone wants to increase body mass, reduce body mass, whether they have a general health goal that they want to work towards, such as reducing the risk of type 2 diabetes, or they have a specific sports performance goal that they want to work towards. Resistance training is generally going to need to be a part of that program. So you can read through what many of the benefits here are on this slide. I'm not going to read each of them off to you, but when we're talking about resistance training, really what's taking place when we perform any sort of resistance training acutely is the breakdown of muscle tissue, right? So anytime we do a resistance training session, our muscles are actually breaking down as a result of the trauma that's elicited on them during that resistance training session. And when that happens, we get slightly weaker, right, during that resistance training session if we don't allow our muscles adequate recovery after that resistance training session. But as part of that muscle breakdown process, the muscle wants to repair. And we know that protein is the macronutrient that helps our muscles prepare, right? Or repair. And so when we perform any sort of resistance training, we're breaking down muscle tissue, and that's going to stimulate protein turnover. And when that happens, that actually increases our metabolic rate. And that could actually require an additional 100 calories or more per day of additional energy that's needed simply to repair muscle tissue. And then additionally, as we do chronic strength training and we increase our lean muscle mass, and note that increasing lean muscle mass doesn't necessarily mean that we're increasing our body weight. It just means that we're improving our body composition overall that we have. So when we're increasing our lean muscle mass, this is in turn means that we're going to require more energy at rest because we have more muscle that we need to maintain. And so per pound of muscle that we add to the body or increase in our lean body mass, we actually burn an additional 20 calories per day per pound of muscle added. So if we add 5 pounds of muscle, we would essentially be again burning an additional 100 calories per day. So if someone has a weight loss goal or a fat loss goal, that can be very beneficial as well. So resistance training isn't just for those who are looking to bulk up or have a specific sports performance goal. Some of our principles of strength training that we have, there are many principles of training that are there, and we went over many of those yesterday. However, there's 3 specifically that apply to resistance training, and I'm saying specifically. And our first training principle that we have is the principle of specificity, and this is a really important one. And what it's telling us is that a client's goal should determine the specific types of training modalities that we place into the individual's training program. And when we're thinking about specificity of training, we want to think about a few different things, right? We want to think about what does the client want to accomplish with body composition goals that they had, and then 2, does that client have a specific performance goal that they have also? And then what are some muscular imbalances or weaknesses that the client may have that they need to improve upon, so that we're reducing the risk of injury moving forward? And specificity is going to play into all of those different factors there. And so, for instance, if someone has a performance goal where they, want to improve their ability to throw a football or throw a baseball, one, we know that we need to train the muscles that are involved in the throwing motion. So that includes the pectoralis major muscle. But then we also need to train the throwing motion as well, so that we are also improving the strength of all of the stabilizing muscles that are required for throwing a ball. And we're also working our joint through its entire range of motion as well. So we have to look at both of those variables that are there when we're talking about specificity of training. We know that the body is only going to adapt to the specific demands that are imposed on it, right? Which is another training principle that we have. So training always needs to be specific to the client's goals that are there, and the movement patterns that they want to improve. The next training principle that we see on here, and I'll lower down to the right-hand side of the screen here, is the principle of progressive overload. And the principle of progressive overload is a simple principle. And when we think about it in terms of resistance training, it makes total sense, right? And so the body must be forced to adapt to or overcome a stress that's greater than is what it normally encountered. So if we're someone who has a job and we're picking up, a 50-pound box multiple times a day, every day for our job, and we want to improve our strength, when we go into the gym and we train, the weight that we need to use should be heavier than 50 pounds, because we've already adapted to that 50-pound weight that's there at our everyday job. And so we need to overload our muscle to make sure that the stimulus is greater than what we're accustomed to, so that when we're repairing, that muscle adapts back stronger and healthier than it was before. And when we're thinking about overload doesn't just need to, overload can occur throughout multiple different variables. So overload can obviously occur through the increased resistance that we use, but it can also occur through increasing our range of motion. And it can also occur through an increase in volume. So either an increase in repetitions or sets as well. So all of those contribute to overload of a muscle. The last principle that we see here is the principle of reversibility. And reversibility, or this principle, is simply referring to the use it or lose it idea, right? So if we have been training, but we stop training for a period of time, the gains that we made while we were training are naturally going to be reversed and move back towards our baseline status. So for someone who hasn't been training for too long a period of time, and maybe they begin training for 8 weeks or so, and then they stop training, they'll return back to baseline after about 3 or 4 weeks. So it doesn't take too long for a beginner to revert back to their baseline levels of strength when they stop training. the longer that we have been training. So, for those who have been going to the gym for years, for professional athletes or collegiate athletes, etc., the principle of reversibility takes a little bit longer to kick in. So the longer we have been training, the longer that we've been building up in our gains, the longer it takes, obviously, for us to return back to baseline levels of strength and fitness. Now, with our principles of strength training, we'll move into some of the acute variables for resistance training that we talked about yesterday. So hopefully these are ones that you're all familiar with now. And these are simply the variables that we can manipulate on a training session to training session, or even an exercise to exercise basis, to give us or to promote a specific adaptation to occur. And so these acute variables are really dictating the amount and type of stress that's going to be placed on us during a resistance training session. The first of these that we see here on the list is frequency. And so when we're thinking about frequency, we're simply referring to the number of times that we are training in a given period of time. So that could be 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, etc. Frequency of training typically refers to how often a muscle or a group of muscles is being trained as well. And so the important thing to keep in mind with frequency of training is that after a training session, after a muscle or a group of muscles have been trained, it typically takes about 48 to 72 hours for that muscle to repair and before it can be trained again. And so that means if we, train our biceps on Monday, they're likely not going to be able to be trained again and repaired to be stimulated again until Wednesday at the earliest. And so anytime we, place our muscle under stress, that causes trauma to the muscle, and we need to make sure that we're giving our muscle adequate time to repair. Our next acute training variable that we have here is intensity. So when we're talking about intensity, we're talking about the amount of effort that's being put forth during a given resistance exercise. So typically this is expressed in terms of percentage of our 1 repetition max. Yesterday, we went over how to calculate percentage of 1 repetition max based off of strength tests that we conduct. Here on this chart, we can see that different training intensities are tied to specific training goals that are there. So if we're looking to increase muscular endurance, right, we're going to be training at 67% or less of our 1 repetition max. If we're training for muscle growth, which is hypertrophy, we're going to be training at a percentage of 67% to 85% of our 1 repetition max. And then if we're training for maximal strength, right, we're going to need to be training close to our 1 repetition max that we have. So that's going to be 85% or greater. Something to keep in mind if we're still not feeling totally comfortable calculating either our own 1 repetition max or the 1 repetition max of our clients, but our clients have a specific training goal that they're looking to accomplish. Say they're looking to increase muscle size, which is muscle hypertrophy, but we don't feel confident calculating the 1 repetition max of the individual. It's still pretty simple as a personal trainer to gauge intensity. And so know that these specific intensity ranges are also tied to repetition ranges, which we'll get to on a given slide or on an upcoming slide. But say if someone should be training at 67 to 85% of their 1 repetition max because they want to grow the size of their muscle, all that means is that the total number of repetitions that they should be able to perform with a weight in a given set is anywhere between 6 to 12 reps. And so if we're getting towards the end of that set and they have a goal of muscle hypertrophy, they get to their 12th rep and they're able to do a 13th repetition, a 14th repetition, or a 15th repetition of that set. We know on that next set, we need to increase the weight because that weight wasn't heavy enough to truly stimulate muscle growth for the client. Same thing if a client's goal is to increase overall muscle strength, but they can do more than 5 repetitions of a given exercise, then we know that weight isn't heavy enough to truly stimulate gains in muscle strength. Throw me a thumbs up in the chat room here if that makes sense. Perfect. All right. We'll go ahead. We'll move over to our next variable here, which is time duration. And so time simply refers to the total amount of time that an activity or an exercise session lasts. With resistance training, time isn't a huge variable that's going to play a role in the type of adaptation that's going to occur. Time or duration plays a greater role when we're referring to our cardiovascular exercise there. A lot of the time that's going to be influenced during a resistance training session is simply influenced by the amount of rest that we're taking in between sets of exercise. And we'll get to that on a later slide. But the amount of rest that we take in between exercise also helps to determine what type of adaptation is going to take place. So typically the variable of time works itself out based off of just the programming that's there for the day. So this is typically the last factor to consider. Type of exercise here that we have, our next variable. Type is simply referring to the mode of exercise here. So obviously can use various modes of resistance training, tools, whether those are dumbbells, barbells, machine weights, kettlebells, medicine balls, etc. Also with this slide, we put on some information regarding hand grip because how we grip a specific mode or tool can impact how our muscles get stimulated during that resistance training exercise. And so say we are performing a lat pull down and we perform the lat pull down with a supinated grip, which is the palms facing up toward the ceiling or towards us, right? If we do that, the bicep is going to become a little bit more engaged in that exercise and is going to help to assist our lats with pulling that bar towards our chin and chest. If we use a pronated grip and we place our hands a little bit wider on the bar, that's going to engage our lats a little bit more, and it's going to reduce the amount that our biceps will be able to assist with the pull on that exercise. So hand grip plays a role in how our muscle gets stimulated during our resistance training sessions. Typically, the most common grips that we're going to see again are that supinated grip, which is the palms facing towards the ceiling or towards the body there. Pronated grips are going to be hands facing down. Neutral grips are just hands or palms facing each other or facing towards the body's midline there. The tempo of exercise is something that's going to help to determine how much time under tension muscle tissues are during a given set of exercise that we have. So when we're talking about tempo, we're talking about 4 different phases during a given lift that we're doing. So let's go ahead and we'll look at the hypertrophy tempo here on this slide, which is a 3-1-3-1 tempo there. And those numbers are numbers in seconds. So that first number that we see, that first 3 count, is referring to the eccentric phase of a movement. So say we're doing a bench press, the 3 seconds down or 3-second tempo during the eccentric phase means that we're going to be lowering the bar for a 3 count there towards our chest. The next number that we see is a 1. That refers to the isometric hold at the bottom of the movement. So we're going to pause at the bottom of that movement for 1 second. And then that next 3 seconds that we see is going to refer to the concentric phase of the movement. So when our primary movers during the exercise are contracting. So in this case, the bench press is going to be our pectoralis major, right? And so now we're going to be doing a 3 count back up, 1, 2, 3. And then the final 1 count there at the end is going to refer to the final isometric hold at the very top of the movement. So we'll pause for 1 second at the top of the movement, and then we'll repeat 3 seconds back down, pause for 1 second at the bottom of the movement, and then 3 seconds back up there to move up towards the top of the movement. When we're talking about tempo and time under tension, and we're thinking about our different goals that we have, such as a goal of muscle hypertrophy, Muscle hypertrophy is really the result of overall muscle damage that occurs to a muscle, and then that muscle grows back bigger and stronger while we're recovering, right? And so muscle damage occurs as a result of two things. One, the amount of weight that we use. So the stimulus or intensity needs to be relatively high. So that's why we have 67 to 85% of our 1 rep max. And then we also need to keep our muscle under a relatively high volume and under a relatively high amount of tension, right? So that we can stimulate maximal damage there. So if we use a high weight and we're under our muscles under tension for a relatively long period of time, we're going to get maximal muscle damage, which allows our muscle then to grow back bigger and stronger with adequate rest. Next variable that we see here is range of motion. Range of motion is simply the total amount of movement around a specific joint or body part. So if we're working through a full range of motion, which is typically ideal, our musculature is getting stronger then throughout that entire range of motion. If we're only working in a partial range of motion, the muscle is only going to get stronger through that movement range that we work in. So if we're only working with partial reps, say in a squat, that means our muscles are only getting stronger through that half squat movement that we're doing. We're not getting stronger at the bottom of a full squat movement. Repetitions, again, is simply the amount of times that a single range of motion is completed for one exercise. Again, here we can see repetitions tied to different goals. This repetition range is also tied to percentage of 1 repetition max as well. So if we're using 85% of our 1 repetition max, we should not be able to do any more than 6 repetitions of that exercise there. If we're using above 90% of our 1 repetition max, we should not be able to do any more than 3 repetitions of that given exercise. Another acute training variable that we have is sets. Sets helps to determine overall volume of a given exercise. And so sets is simply the number of times that a group of repetitions is completed. Again, sets are tied to specific training goals that we have. We know that for a goal such as hypertrophy, we need a little bit higher volume. When we're doing things such as developing maximal strength, because our total number of repetitions is lower, we're only working for 1 to 5 repetitions in a given set to make sure that the muscle has been stimulated adequately and our central nervous system has been stimulated adequately. We still need to be using a 3 to 5 set range as well. But obviously our total volume is a little bit lower because we're using less repetitions during those sets of exercise that's there. Getting to our last variable that we have here for acute training variables that help us to determine the type of muscle adaptation that would occur as a result of exercise, we have rest. And so rest is simply the amount of time that's allowed between sets. And we allow a given amount of time in between sets for certain metabolic recovery of exercise. So notice for maximal strength, we're getting quite a bit of rest in between sets of exercise there because we want to make sure, again, that our ATP-CP system is nearly fully recovered before going into our next set of exercise there. We're not so much worried about muscle breakdown when we're developing maximal strength. We're more worried about maintaining total body coordination during a given movement, since a lot of our muscular strength gains comes in the forms of increasing neurological strength, which is the amount of motor units that we can recruit in a given movement. In order to do that, we need quite a bit of rest in between exercise. All right. So now we come up to benefits and differences between free weights and machine weights. This is something that I'm sure that both of you on this call are familiar with. But free weights are simply referring to loads that are not attached to an apparatus. So when we're talking about free weights, we're talking about things such as barbells, dumbbells, kettlebells, plates, etc. And then weight machines are going to be the pieces of equipment that have a fixed or variable range of motion, and they use gravity and a load to generate a greater resistance there. So weight machines are things like our cable machines, leg press machines, chest press machines, etc. So both free weights and machine weights have a time and place in training sessions, and it's really going to depend on client's skill level and goal as to what we are typically using. And so you can read through here what some of the benefits of free weights are. I'm not going to read each of these back to you, but the primary benefit that we see of free weights is that it allows our muscles to move through a full range, or allows our joints to move through a full range of motion during given movements that we have, and also allows our bodies to move a little bit more naturally than machine weights would allow us to do. The other primary benefits of free weights that we see is that free weights promote the incorporation of compound movements in our exercise program as well. And it's easier to vary the speed at which we use free weights than it may be for machine weights as well. And so when we're using free weights, we're moving through a full range of motion. And then we're able to recruit more stabilizing muscles during movements as well. So typically they can help to promote better overall musculature balance in our bodies. Now, drawbacks of free weights here. When we think about the drawbacks of free weights, it's really that free weights tend to give us a little bit less control than a machine weight would, because we are recruiting more stabilizing muscles during a given movement. So for certain people who may be new to resistance training, incorporation of a free weight may make the weight a little bit more complex and require a little bit more coordination. So occasionally individuals will first need to develop strength on machine weights before they move to free weights. Additionally, when we're working with free weights, the environment that we're in can be a little bit less stable than machine weights as well, which can make free weights slightly less safe for a novice trainee. And the benefits of machine weights. The benefits of machine weights ties back a little bit to the drawbacks of free weights, right? So the benefit of free weights is that you're really working through a fixed range of motion on a pretty stable plane. So they're a little bit safer and easier to learn movement patterns in than free weights may be. Also, when working on machine weights, they can have the benefit of simply being quicker to use, right? There might be less setup on free weights than there are with certain dumbbells and benches, or putting plates onto a barbell, etc. So those would be some of the primary benefits of weight machines that we would see over free weights. Machine weights also could arguably isolate muscles a little bit better than a free weight machine, or than a dumbbell or barbell could as well. So if we're really looking at developing strength through a single joint movement, or isolating a muscle in a specific movement, which certain individuals may have a goal of, incorporating machine weights into their training regimen may be something to consider there. And then we get to the drawback of machine weights. And the drawback of machine weights are really the benefits of free weights that we have. And so the drawback of machine weights, again, are that we're working in a fixed range of motion. And so we may not be able to develop muscular strength through a full range of motion, or we may not be able to make the training program specific to whatever our client's goal may be. In addition to free weights and machine weights, we can also consider body weight exercises. Body weight exercises such as push-ups and pull-ups would also be a way to conduct resistance training. Body weight exercises are a great way to learn movements. We can develop strength and muscle hypertrophy through body weight exercises as well. However, a drawback of body weight exercises is that there's typically no way to add resistance to that exercise unless we put on a weight vest or something along those manners. But because of that, then how we overload our muscles during that body weight exercise is limited by one variable, because we can't add resistance. And so then we can only overload our muscles through increasing volume. And once we increase volume past a certain point, we're simply developing muscular endurance. We're not developing muscular strength or hypertrophy. All right, how we all doing here as we move on to chapter 13, exercise selection and technique? Still following along? Anything popping up for anyone? You are a great group to work with here. Appreciate your attention. So chapter 13, about to call your PT and ask if you can shift your programming. That's awesome. That's awesome. Very good. And that's why we use this information, right? Is we want to be able to apply it to how could this make us a little bit more adaptable. So wonderful. Glad that the information's applying to what you're going through, and that's how we learn it. So wonderful. All right. So chapter 13 is exercise selection and technique. Again, here we have different learning objectives for this chapter. There is quite a bit in chapter 13 as there was in chapter 12 as well. So we're a little bit limited as to what we can actually cover in the lecture, but we're going to hit the key points here, the really big things and things that I think are most applicable to a personal trainer when working with clients. And so when we're talking about exercise selection and technique, we're going to start off our conversation with cueing here. And when we talk about cueing, we're really referring to coaching technique. And we can go ahead and click on over to the next slide with this. And so exercise technique for most novice and intermediate trainees is really influenced by the coaching technique. And the coaching technique is what the personal trainer is using. And our coaching technique comes down to how we cue different exercises and different movement patterns that are there. And so as a personal trainer, it's really important to cultivate a greater understanding of cues that work best for our clients based off of their learning style. And we can determine what our clients' learning styles are through observation or by simply asking our clients, hey, how do you learn movement patterns best? And the three learning styles that are typically identified with both children and adult learners are visual learners, auditory learners, and kinesthetic learners. And so when we're talking about the visual learner, we're talking about someone who learns best through seeing information being taught. And in the form of a personal trainer, that means through a personal trainer demonstrating the movement that the client is to be performing. So that means the personal trainer can describe the movement all the live long day, but the person isn't really going to learn that movement until they see the personal trainer demonstrate the movement pattern for them. Next up, we have the auditory learning style. So auditory learning style is really how we're conducting most of our lecture series here. You're getting a little bit of visual learning with the slides, but you're primarily learning through verbal instruction here. And so people who prefer an auditory learning style prefer to hear the instructions that are given to them. Oftentimes, auditory learners often like to repeat back the information to the personal trainer as well. So this is where it's important to learn those or utilize those listening skills that we talked about on our Monday session. And then lastly, we have kinesthetic learners. Kinesthetic learners oftentimes learn best through hands-on activities or best through touch, right? And that could be the touch of the personal trainer as well. And we'll talk a little bit about how to use kinesthetic cueing here momentarily, but it's not something that should be used with everyone. We always want to make sure that we have consent when placing our hands on a client, but it can definitely be a good cueing technique to get someone into a proper body position during certain exercises, or to make sure that primary muscles are engaged during specific exercises as well. So first up here, we have visual cueing. Again, when we're talking about visual cueing, with clients who prefer to learn this way. We're talking about those who learn best through seeing the personal trainer demonstrate the movement. And so you as a personal trainer better be able to perform the movement that you want your client to perform. And you better be able to perform that movement in a clear and concise manner so that the individual who learns through visual cueing is able to see proper completion of that movement. Typically, when we do visual cueing or visual coaching for a client, we're going to move slightly slower in that movement than the movement would typically be performed during that exercise. And that gives the individual a little bit more time to process what they're seeing. We don't want to move in slow motion, but we're going to move a little bit slower during that movement pattern than typically how that exercise would be performed. Verbal cueing is our next one. Verbal cueing is something that all personal trainers are going to be using, just like visual cueing. Those are the most common methods that are there. With verbal cueing, some things to keep in mind are that we should avoid over-instructing the client or avoid narrating every movement that the client does. There's only so much that a client can process at a given time. So we want to make sure that what we are saying is actually important for the client to take in. The second thing to keep in mind here is that personal trainers should avoid using overly technical language with a client as well. So we should use simple phrases that a client may understand. So say we are cueing the squat movement for a client, and a common error that we see during a squat movement are the knees collapsing inward, right? Valgus bending of those knees. So those knees collapsing together. So a simple way that we could cue the client to drive their knees back outward, right? So that they're not collapsing their knees inward, is simply to tell the client to spread the floor apart with their feet. And that's going to be the cue that we use for them. That's something that they can visualize, and that's something that they can actively do, right? Trying to spread the floor apart as they're standing back up through that squat movement to prevent the knees from collapsing inward. So that's a way that we can use common language to cue our clients verbally. Our last cueing or coaching method that we have here is for our kinesthetic learners. And again, kinesthetic learners learn best through touch or hands-on learning. So typically with what this means for a personal trainer is that we are going to be placing our hands on a client, to either make sure that muscles are being activated during a specific movement, or to put our clients in a correct movement pattern. So anytime we're incorporating physical touch right into our coaching methodology, the first and most important thing to keep in mind is that we always get the client's consent to touch them. And so we just want to say something along the lines of, hey, is it okay if I place my hands on you real quick to get you into an appropriate position, and wait for the client to give you permission to put your hands on them. And then the second thing that we want to keep in mind is that our touch isn't overly aggressive as well. So we don't want that touch to be overly hard on the client. We want to put enough pressure so that the client is able to respond to getting into the position or activating the muscles that we want them to activate. But we don't want to be pressing overly aggressive on the client as well in a manner that could hurt them or make them feel uncomfortable. So a couple of common sense things, but common sense things can kind of slip our minds, especially when we're working with our first few clients. So that's something that we really want to make sure that we're conscious of when we use a kinesthetic cueing approach for our clients, which is something that all personal trainers are going to have to do at some point in their coaching career. Any questions on cueing here before we get into the last little bit of our lecture for today, which is movement categories? All right. Awesome. I'll take a quick sip here, and then we'll set in for our last 20 minutes. So the movement categories that we have, we have 6 fundamental movement categories for a client. In these 6 fundamental movement categories are movement patterns that really all clients should be training. These movement patterns really apply to developing overall musculature balance throughout the body, which is really important, obviously, so that we don't have postural deviations or put excess pressure on certain joints in our body. And then they also promote optimal movement patterns as well for clients from that have any goal that they're working towards. So you can read through what the 6 fundamental movement categories are. We're going to talk through them momentarily. In addition to the 6 fundamental movement categories that are here, there's also 2 additional exercise categories. Core training is typically going to be incorporated. Core training is typically going to be incorporated into most training programs that are there, simply because developing a strong core does 2 things for us. One, it helps us to prevent injuries, and our core is how we transfer energy throughout the body as well. So when we have a strong core, we're better able to transfer power and strength throughout the limbs and the rest of our body as well. So generally everyone's going to incorporate some form of core training into their program. Isolation and activation exercises, we'll talk about those towards the end of our slide deck. Those are going to be incorporated into a training program, really dependent on what the client's needs are. So do they have a specific goal that requires single joint isolation movements, such as a bicep curl, leg extension, tricep extension, etc.? Or do they have a severe musculature imbalance in the body? So say maybe they have weak quadricep muscles in relation to overly active hamstrings, and that may require the client to do some leg extension exercises in their program to improve overall strength of the quadricep so that it has an appropriate strength ratio to the hamstring. So again, isolation activation exercises are really going to be dependent to incorporate into an exercise program depending on what the client's goals and needs are. And goals and needs, again, goals are the ultimate outcome. Needs are what our client's strengths and weaknesses that they have. All right, our hinge movement is the first fundamental movement pattern that we'll talk about. A hinge movement needs to be mastered early on in someone's training program because it relates to overall safety of picking weights up off the ground, right? And so when we're talking about a hinge movement, it's a forward and backward movement of the upper body while the hips remain at the same height. And our primary mover here is going to be our gluteus maximus. And so when we see an example of a hip hinge movement, we can see on the next slide here that the client is performing a Romanian deadlift in this movement. And the Romanian deadlift is the common hinge movement that we would start a client with when we're talking about the hip hinge. We would typically start them using, a wooden stick with this. So it's an unloaded movement if a client is new to the hip hinge pattern. Notice with this hip hinge here on the individual, if you're looking at the right-hand side, the right-hand picture where he's flexed forward at the hips at, his back is remaining flat. His shoulders are pulled back and he's squeezing his scapula or shoulder blades together. His head is in a neutral position as well. So his chin's not tucked in or his neck isn't hyperextended backwards there. Other things to keep in mind is that the toes stay pointed forward and the knees stay pointed forward as well during this movement. And we're going to keep a slight bend in the knees during that hip hinge movement as well. Then when we move back into that standing position, upright position, right, we're simply going to be driving our hips forward by squeezing our glutes. And that's how we return back up to that starting position movement. We keep our shoulders pulled back so that we prevent our shoulders from rounding forward. Next movement that we have is the upper body push movement. Upper body push movements are typically movements that are relatively easy to master for clients because it's something that we're doing relatively often in our everyday life. So the primary joints involved in pressing movement or a pushing movement, whether that is going to be an overhead or a vertical press or a horizontal press, is going to be our shoulder joint and then our elbow joint as well. And then depending on if we're doing an overhead press, or which would also be a vertical press, our shoulder, our deltoid would be the primary mover there. If we're doing a horizontal press, which would be a chest press, our pectoralis major would be the primary mover during that movement. When cueing pushing movements, the things that we're really going to look for is that the client is able to maintain a neutral position of the spine. So a common error that we may see with people of all levels when performing a push movement is arching of the back, which is also hyperextension of the spine. Or, if a client's on a bench, the hips coming up off the bench there. So those are things that we want to keep in mind. The other thing we want to keep in mind when teaching the push movement is that we're moving through a full range of motion. And we want to be doing that with all movements that are here, but especially our push movements that we have, because tightness through the chest is a very common tightness, overactive chest muscles that are there simply because of how people sit in their everyday lives, myself included at a computer a lot. And so we want to make sure that we're able to move our shoulder and our elbow joint through their entire range of motion. Next up, we have the pull movements. So this is, again, going to be an upper body pull movement. These can be vertical, again, which is an overhead pull, such as a pull-up or a lat pull-down, or they can be horizontal pulls. Horizontal pulls would be our bent-over rows or cable rowing movements that we do, right? So regardless of the type of pull movement that we do, as with the push movement, the shoulder joint, the elbow joint are going to be the primary joints that are involved there. And depending if we're going overhead, our latissimus dorsi is going to be a little bit more active. And if we're pulling in a horizontal fashion, our rhomboids are going to be a little bit more active during that movement. As with upper body push movements, with upper body pull movements, again, we want to make sure that the client is able to maintain neutral spine and also that we're moving through a full range of motion during those movements. Next up, we have the squat movement here. So squats can be relatively difficult to master for novice and intermediate trainees. And so squats, again, are going to involve the hip, knee, and ankle joint. Primary movers here, again, are going to be our glutes and our quadriceps as well, because our glutes extend our hips and our quadricep extends our knees, which is what we need to do to get back up to the top of our squat position. An example of a squat that we see, and typically the easiest squat to learn outside of an unloaded squat, is going to be our goblet squat, which is where we simply hold a weight right underneath of our chin. So some key things to keep in mind with our squat here. Ideally, we want to be able to work through a full range of motion, and we're able to master that full range of motion in an unloaded manner first before we add weight to it. So when we're doing that, we should be able to get our thigh parallel to the ground, so our hip in line with our knee. Our back should remain relatively flat, and our chest should remain upright during that squatting movement. Then we want to make sure that our knees remain over our ankles and our toes stay pointed forward, and we mitigate collapsing inward on our feet, so rolling our feet inward. We want to make sure that we're able to maintain a neutral position from our feet. We're not falling forward, and we're able to drive up through our midfoot back into that standing position. Next up here, we have the lunge. A lunge tends to be a little bit easier lower body movement to learn for most than the squat or the hip hinge. So a lunge is simply a step forward or lateral and then a return back to the starting position. Again, hip, knee, and ankle joints are going to be involved here with this. So with a lunge movement, we typically start clients with learning a forward lunge. With a forward lunge, some things that we want to keep in mind. Again, neutral spine, chest remains relatively upright here. Head stays in a neutral position. And then when we're stepping forward, we want to make sure that we're able to get to a 90-degree angle with both the knee and hip that are there so that our thigh is parallel to the ground. Our front knee should remain over our ankle. Again, we want to prevent the foot from collapsing inward, which is going to be a common error that we see. Next up, we have our locomotion exercises. So locomotion exercises simply refers to the ability to move from one place to another. These, when it refers to resistance training, we're typically going to be carrying some sort of weight with that. And so when we're thinking about locomotion movements, we want to make sure that our kinetic chain is remaining relatively intact during that movement, especially when we're carrying weights, right? So when we're doing a locomotion movement on this next slide here, we're going to see an example of a farmer's carry. And with a farmer's carry, well, it looks like a relatively simple movement to do. Again, we want to make sure that we're preventing our shoulders from being pulled up towards our ears. So we want to make sure that our shoulders are staying pulled together. Hands are by our sides. Our spine is staying in a neutral position. So we're not collapsing forward or hyperextending backwards here on that side, during that movement. Again, we want to make sure that we're preventing the feet from collapsing inwards while we are walking as well. So some things to keep in mind there as we're watching our clients conduct those movements. Next up, we have our core training. So when we're talking about our core training, we talked a little bit about this yesterday. We're referring to muscles in our abdomen, but we're also referring to muscles beyond that as well. So muscles in our low back, hips, and our pelvic muscles as well. I already mentioned what some of the benefits here are of core training, right? So safety reasons, and then also for power transfer too. The example of core training that we see on the next slide is going to be our abdominal crunch. Planks are also going to be common core movements that we do. We could also be doing double leg bridges, single leg bridges, torso rotations, placing bands around the knees. So all sorts of things relate to core exercises when we're activating the muscles of our hips, pelvis, low back, and abdomen. Lastly, here we have our isolation exercises and activation exercises. So slight difference between the two. Isolation exercises are going to be our single joint movements. So think bicep curl, tricep extension, etc. Activation exercises are really low intensity exercises that we include either as part of a warm-up or as part of a corrective exercise program. So again, this could be things such as a single leg bridge or a double leg bridge to activate the muscles of our glutes. It could be placing a band around our wrist and then driving our arms outward to activate the muscles of our shoulders. It could be even activating our core muscles through simple plank movements and stuff like that. All would be considered activation exercises. The example here of the tricep extension that of the isolation exercise that we see is the tricep extension. Again, when coaching isolation movements, we always want to make sure that even though it's a single joint movement, we're able to move through that full range of motion and that we're able to maintain neutral spine during that movement as well. So it's very common to see people round forward or hyperextend backward when performing isolation exercises. Both of those increase our risk of injury and lead to greater musculature imbalances in the body. Final thought here when coaching exercises is to make sure that we always have a progression or regression for a given exercise based on how the client's feeling that day and their ability level. So a progression is simply a way to increase the challenge of the exercise that we have. We can do that through placing the individual on an unstable surface, increasing the load, increasing volume, increasing range of motion, etc. A regression of an exercise is simply the opposite, right? We can put a person on a more stable surface. We can put them into a machine. We can reduce the range of motion or the complexity of the exercise so that the exercise becomes easier. for the client. And we always want to make sure that our program is adaptable, because clients come to us in different conditions each and every day, based off of how life has been treating them. So with that, that wraps up all of our slides for this morning's session. Any questions here in the final couple minutes that we have? I know this afternoon you're going to be back in here. You're going to be back discussing nutrition and supplementation. Tomorrow morning, we'll be getting back into another lecture together. I'll be here with you tomorrow morning. We're going to be discussing chronic conditions and then lifespan populations at that time. All right. Well, you've been a wonderful group to work with. I really appreciate your attention during this. Know that I'm continuing to be here as a resource for you, so I'll be back with you tomorrow. Always feel free to ping up any questions at that time, and look forward to seeing you all then. So have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye.